Kings have the extra attacker. Extra attacker out in the net empty. Drop back and score! With the extra attacker!
The Extra Attackers Podcast with Maude and Jordan.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Extra Attackers Podcast. Maude and Jordan back here once again. Today, going to be discussing the biggest story in the hockey world over the last 3 days, which has surprisingly been an empty net goal and the reaction to it. A little bit of an altercation between the Senators' Greig and the Toronto Maple Leafs' Morgan Reilly. At the time of recording this, the hearing with the NHL Discipline Department for Morgan Reilly has been completed, but they have not yet announced what the suspension will be. We might hear about that during the show. We're going to keep refreshing Twitter to see if the news drops and we can get a live reaction to it. But I'll just throw it to you to start, Jordan. What do you think? What's your prediction of how many games Reilly is going to get for this whole scuffle?
I mean, knowing that it's an in-person hearing, we know definitively that it will be at least 5 games, I believe. I would say it's probably going to be 5 or 6, I assume, just based off of what the framing of having an in-person hearing is, and as well based off the entire incident. So if you don't know basically what happened, but I'm sure everyone knows, at the end of the game, it was 4-3 versus the Ottawa Senators and the Toronto Maple Leafs. They're, of course, huge rivals. It's the Battle of Ontario. With about 5 seconds left to go, Greig gets sent on a breakaway on the empty net. Toronto had pulled their goalie to try to tie the game as it was 4-3. And Greig unleashes a slapper about 5 feet away from the net. And peels off to the corner, doesn't really celebrate. But then following behind him on the play was Morgan Reilly. And Morgan Reilly is clearly not happy about what happened and just immediately gives him a cross check to the head in retaliation. Greig falls. It seems like he was okay. He was at practice today, so luckily there was no injury there. So that was kind of the situation. I do want to make it very clear before talking about it that I mean, we've said it multiple times. We are Ottawa Senators fans, so we do have some pretty ingrained bias in what's happening here. I want to make that very clear. But I do think that from the other side of things, because I do think that Reilly deserves to be suspended. I do believe that it should be harsh. I do believe from that side of it that there is a very objective view of what happened, and there are a lot of very poor arguments from people who are trying to dismiss what Reilly did. But with that context, what did you think of the incident, Maude?
It's funny because in the moment when he slapped it into the empty net, I didn't really think anything of it. I didn't even really think... I guess I didn't know enough about the hockey code, and I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit later about what the code is. But apparently it is an unwritten rule that you should not ever be taking a slap shot into an empty net. And it was just oh... He put an exclamation mark on the win, and that was cool. And then he got jumped for it. And again, I think the most rational take here on this subject is it's perfectly fine for Morgan Reilly to show a bit of anger and go after Greig for doing that. But you never attack with your stick up high. That's the key thing here. Is I would have to say if the code says that you can jump people for certain things, I'm pretty sure the code also says not to cross-check people in the head over certain things. The code is that you challenge them to a fight. And I think if Morgan Reilly tried to fight Greig, not that Greig is much of a fighter either, but I don't think Morgan Reilly would have done very well in a fight. So he took the cheap way out and just went for a cheap shot. So I think no matter what the suspension ends up being, it's going to be very deserved.
Yeah, I would generally agree. I mean, it literally went viral in a sense. It was all the hockey world was talking about for the last couple days, even. And there's a lot of polarizing opinions. I've seen Leafs fans analyzing the clip frame by frame, being if you look here, it shows Greig's hand and it tips off his hand, and then it actually tips off his shoulder and then goes into his head.
That's some victim blaming logic.
Yeah, I think that's true. I also think that 99% of the time when I see that breakdown, it's of the angle that's coming from the TSN view on the looking at the parallel to the ice, right? However, there is an angle that looks straight down the glass at it happening, and from that angle, I think you were being purposefully you're purposely misrepresenting the situation if you don't think that Greig directly went for his head or upper body area. Even, or Reilly went for Greig's upper body area. Even if you do think that he was more going for like a shoulder tap, that's a really negligent play to make, knowing how close it could be to the head. So I still don't think that's a great counter argument. I think objectively, it was clearly supposed to be a headshot, an upper body shot. That shouldn't happen. You should be more careful. And I mean, I guess this is the best time to get into the whole code conversation.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, I understand that I have not played high level professional hockey. I did play house league hockey, as did Maude. We both played house league hockey, not to super high levels or anything like that, but we did play hockey. We did play beer league. So we do have some playing experience, not to the degree that other people do. And like you're kind of seeing a mixed reaction. Some players will come out and say, "Yeah, no, this shouldn't have happened," and then other players are kind of saying, "Yeah, it's part of the code. Like you should expect retaliation." I do want to say that any code that includes a purposeful headshot, a purposeful intent to injure, is objectively broken. That should never be the reaction to anything.
The thing is, I feel like the code doesn't include that, but people are just making exceptions because they're so angry about the empty net thing that they're just like excusing a headshot regardless. Like, I don't think that should ever really be accepted, and they're just making excuses for it, which is what really bothers me.
No, I completely agree. I don't really think there is a code around that. I think you could fairly say there's a code around reacting to that situation. And I think in a game like hockey, where physicality is very encouraged, less so than it used to be, but in a safe, like respected manner, physicality is a part of the game. You see it a lot in the playoffs where a physical team like Florida makes it way farther than you expect because they're like a punchy, grindy team that understands that whistles kind of go away in the playoffs to some extent. So there's more that you can get away with, and they get far that way. But in that sense, and I know Florida has done dirty things. I'm not trying to absolve them of that. But in that sense, intent to injure play should never be respected under that physicality. It's completely different. Like you said, I think the right opinion here is if Reilly had gone up to Greig and tried to challenge him to a fight, a cross check to the ribs, a face wash, just talking to him, like yelling at him, that's all completely fine. That's within the normal parameters of what you would expect in hockey. And I mean, if you're talking about a code, I think that is the code. I think that's the understanding of what you can do. The headshot is where it goes way too far for me. Like, you can't do that. That's just purposefully intending to injure another player. And now that we have so much more data of what headshots mean, what they do to long-term life after playing hockey, you have to be so careful, like so incredibly careful. And that's one reason why I'm not really bothered that it's an in-person hearing, because I feel like any sort of check to the head should be harsh. And there's a lot of Leafs fans, obviously, that are saying, look at all these instances over the last season where Peros and the Department of Player Safety have taken this incident and given one game when it should have been way more. That happens. It shouldn't happen. But just because those incidents happened where the punishment wasn't harsh enough doesn't mean that Reilly should get off scot-free for what happened. It doesn't mean that it should be a 1 or 2 game. This deserves to be harsh, so I'm glad it is.
I wanted to bring that up. Is one of the worst arguments I've seen from Leafs fans and media over this whole ordeal is like, oh, look at this previous play where someone else got cross-checked and they only got a 1-game suspension or 2-game suspension, so they shouldn't come down hard on Reilly. That is not how this should work. Yeah, the Department of Player Safety is really inconsistent and has made poor decisions in the past. I will say that Reilly should get at least 5 games, and those other cross-checks that they've been pulling the clips of from like 3-4 years ago, those should have also been punished to about the same degree. So I think it's incredibly disingenuous to be like, oh, our guy did something really bad, well, let me go back and see other similar things that weren't punished as harshly and say the league is biased against the Leafs. No, we already saw David Perron get 6 games for an incredibly similar incident this year. So to me, that means that the Department of Player Safety is cracking down harder on cross-checks to the head, which they should be, and they should continue that trajectory with the Morgan Reilly decision. So pointing back 4 years ago and saying, oh, they didn't act like this back then, so Reilly should get a lesser suspension, I think that's just complete BS.
No, I agree, because you need to take that out of the game if you can. A headshot can't be a part of it just because it's so detrimental to a player's future in a lot of ways. It could even threaten their playing career if it goes really badly. And frankly, Reilly is lucky that Greig didn't get injured on this play. If he had got a concussion, the punishment would have been harsher. And I understand that even this season, the Department of Player Safety has made mistakes. There have been suspensions that have not been long enough, but this should still be harsh. Those should still be harsh suspensions. Going forward, any sort of headshot should be a harsh suspension, especially if it's intentional. And this was intentional. This was completely intentional. And I also want to point out, like, I'm seeing a ton of arguments from people that are basically saying, like, well, you didn't want Reilly to do anything. And that's just a straw man. Just because we don't think that Morgan Reilly should have essentially tried to knock Greig out, that doesn't mean we don't think he should have done nothing. I think him standing up for the team for like what happened, that's perfectly fine. Like, it's justifiable if you go about it the right way. It's part of the game of hockey. So a lot of people are pointing it out and being purposely obtuse and using that to kind of, how do you say, misrepresent the argument in a way that's not fair. The argument is that he should have just done what was acceptable as long as that didn't intend to injure the other player. He intended to injure the other player. That can never be acceptable. A 5+ suspension is completely deserved.
And I hate the narrative that the Leafs fans and media have taken of like, oh, it's good that Reilly did this because if he didn't, then people would be calling the Leafs soft, which they seem to think is an unfair criticism. But in my mind, getting that angry over an empty net goal just makes you look soft. Getting that extremely ridiculous, like I couldn't believe how angry he was. It was just very silly. Like I screeched when I saw that. I was like laughing, and then I got mad after when I realized that it was a cross check to the neck. But I couldn't believe that he was going after a guy for an empty net goal. And sure, it was a little bit showboaty, but they're showboating all the time in the NHL. Like, no one went over and decked Jake Wallman after he did the gritty in overtime the same day. Like, to me, I feel like dancing the gritty on someone after you score the game-winning goal is more disrespectful than a slap shot on an empty net. Like, and I'm not saying that Wallman should have been attacked or anything for that, because there's nothing wrong with that. I like to see big celebrations and personality from the players. I love when he does the gritty dance, but it's a weird, like, very specific thing here where for some reason the empty net is super sacred and you better not hit the puck really hard into it. You better be really nice to our empty net and just slide the puck in super softly and be delicate so that you don't hurt our feelings. And like, apparently, according to a bunch of former players and stuff, this is something that's regarded as showboating, but I don't see why it would be that big of a deal that you would just like see red and have to like take a cheap shot at a guy over that. And once again, I would have no issue with Reilly going to try to fight Greig, but I was very surprised that this is something where a bunch of former players and media are just being like, yeah, he deserved it because he shot the puck too hard. Like, to me, it would be worse if he did something like to me, if your goalie is in the net and the guy cranks a slap shot on a breakaway, you know, like we saw Claude Giroux score last year, isn't that more disrespectful than on an empty net because you're taking a slap shot at close range on a breakaway? Like, isn't that, like, that could potentially, like, hit the goalie somewhere and it'll hurt him, you know? Like, get in between the padding or something? Isn't that more reckless than just shooting on an empty net? Like, it's really weird.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, like in the right context, I think people would see it like that. Like if you're up like 7-3 and you're on a breakaway and you take like a slapper like right at the goalie, like people would be upset. And I think that's kind of justified because there's kind of no reason, and slap shots hurt. Like, I'm a goalie, I understand. It's a good chance to get injured at times, so that would be penalized. But at the same time, if that happened and then the response from the other team was to go cross check the guy in the head, I would never think that was correct. And I mean, that's another point that a lot of people are bringing up. Even Elliot Friedman, which kind of disappointed me, to be honest. But he kind of said, if the situation was reversed, you would be cheering on your player. Like if Brady Tkachuk had done that to, I don't know, Matthew Nyes after he scored a slap shot into an empty net, you'd be cheering and be saying, yeah, we're defending our pride. I wouldn't be. Like, I think objectively, completely untrue. Objectively, I would just be like, no, Brady should never do that. I think a response is appropriate, but not that sort of intend to injure response. And like you said with the Jake Wallman bit, like, I agree. Like, wouldn't that be more disrespectful? And even though I think that the Jake Wallman thing is incredibly cringe, I don't think he should get like any retaliation for it. He's showing like personality, right? And I don't think we need less of that. I think we need more. And it's the same thing with the Ridley Greig incident. He's in a building where 75% of the fans are Leafs fans, It's the biggest rivalry, arguably in the NHL. It's the biggest rivalry. The team fought tooth and nail to win that game. They played pretty well. He slaps it into the empty net to say, goodbye, guys, game's over, to all those Leafs fans that are in the building. Why are we discouraging that? And even like the conversation around it has erupted into like a reignition of the Battle of Ontario, which has been stale for a while now. So I don't get why people are so upset about that. Like, it doesn't make sense to me, and it surely doesn't support any sort of retaliation, especially, I mean, it supports some retaliation, but not what Reilly did. So yeah, that part bothers me.
Yeah, I think Elliot Friedman's arguments were totally disingenuous, and I was really disappointed in how he was speaking on this issue on the 32 Thoughts podcast. Just the argument of like, oh, yeah, you think my position is dumb, but if you were me, you would also argue my dumb argument. Like, no, we're not you. You think differently. Like, it seems that like he's trying to say that, oh, I'm not biased because you would think the same thing if you were in my position, but it's like, no, you're biased because you think that this is the only way that you should think in your position. If we were in your position, if it was Brady Tkachuk who had done this, we would say that was really bad. He let his emotions get the best of him and he should be suspended, instead of making excuses for it and saying like, oh, really, Greig provoked him. I think that was just an absolutely terrible argument from Friedman, and I was really frustrated listening to that because he repeated it over and over and over, which to me just shows that he had really no defense of Reilly's actions other than just to be like, just like totally siding with Leafs fans and just being like, well, Leafs fans might be crazy, but everyone's crazy. So like, it's just stupid. I think it's a very anti-intellectual argument.
I agree. And like, I've seen Elliot like talk with a lot more nuance about other subjects before, which is why it was even more disappointing. Like, I wasn't surprised when the Sportsnet panel was terrible. Like after the game, like specifically Ron McLean, Kevin Bietsa, and Jennifer Botterill, awful takes, especially. And I don't want to single her out on purpose, but Jennifer Botterill, like a month or two ago, had this big speech during a Hockey Night in Canada segment where she was explicitly calling out head hits and talking about how dangerous they were, how they weren't a part of the game at all. And she completely switched just because it was the Leafs that did it, because she's on Sportsnet and probably a Leafs fan for what I imagine. It was absolute hypocrisy. And we're seeing a lot of that from a bunch of Leafs fans who I think in other circumstances would condemn this sort of action, but they're only supporting it because the Leafs did it. They want to protect their baby franchise that can't take a slap shot to an empty net. It's really frustrating to see that. And like, I watched the clip. I was watching it with my girlfriend actually, and we both gasped when we saw the Reilly head hit, because we were like, that can't happen. Like, what the hell just happened? You can't do that. That reaction wouldn't have changed if the situations were reversed at all. It would have been the same thing. And again, like, just talking about this, acting like Greig should have expected it. It's part of the code. This is why people call out elements of toxic hockey culture, because there's absolutely no benefit to going and trying to hit someone in the head in retaliation because you're upset. It's not even a respect thing. That could legitimately alter someone's life if it goes the worst way possible. Being like, if part of the code was just you handle it physically, you go, you push them around, you fight them, whatever. Understandable. There's some like respect, like just there's some like respect, I don't know, politics and that. I can understand a reaction. It can never be justified as a part of this. That's why people are talking about toxic culture. And it's disappointing to see. Well, I mean, specifically Leafs fans, I've seen a lot of fans from other teams just say, yeah, that was garbage. That should never happen. Kind of like a 31 versus 1 sort of band together moment for a lot of the league, which I appreciate because I think that's the right opinion in general. But that's why this narrative is forming. And I haven't heard a single good argument from Leafs fans of why this should be basically swept under the rug. Like, there hasn't been one. It's just disappointing.
Yeah, one more note on the code is that I think it's a huge cop-out when these former players just say, like, oh, well, that's the code, so Greig should have known that something was coming. The whole point that we're trying to make is that maybe the code needs a bit of updating. If the code doesn't exclude cross checks to the head, if the code just says like, oh, that's fine, you can do that to someone because they shot the puck too hard into the empty net, then maybe you should rethink the code a little bit, instead of these retired players just being like, oh, you're all a bunch of idiots who never played hockey and don't know the code. And it's like, well, we're aware of the code now and it's dumb and we're criticizing it, and that's the point. Like, it's
Exactly.
just so ridiculous. And yeah, like, I don't want to go too hard on Jennifer Botterill because I generally like her takes, and I think she's the best on the Sportsnet panel of who they currently have. But it just seemed like a huge case of homerism to me too, because you brought up the previous clip a few months ago where she was debating with Jamal Myers. I think it was about when Ryan Hartman high sticks Cole Perfetti and admitted that it was on purpose, right?
Yeah.
The whole debate there was that Jamal Myers was saying that, well, Brendan Dillon injured Kirill Kaprizov, so the Jets had to know that a response was coming, and then Botterill was saying, that's BS, you shouldn't just go after Brendan Dillon, but you shouldn't just go after their young rookies like Cole Perfetti. Like, he didn't do anything, he doesn't deserve it. You shouldn't just go for retribution just because something happened in a previous game. And then now in this situation, she says, oh, well, this rookie had it coming because of what he did, which just seems completely hypocritical to me. And it seems like an example of like, yeah, you work for Rogers and Rogers owns the Maple Leafs, so you kind of just have to ride for them no matter what.
Yeah, it really does seem like that. And I do agree. Like, I don't think she does not in any way deserve to be harassed for the incident or anything like that. I want to make that explicitly clear. Like, I know she had to block people on Twitter and stuff.
Yeah,
and
I
I'm
saw
sure there's some hateful things being said. That's not right. It's perfectly legitimate to critique what she said and call her out for it as blatant hypocrisy. But she is generally a good presence on that panel. So like, there's a level. I want to make that clear.
Mm-hmm.
But also, like, you also need to call out Kevin Bieksa as well, as a former
Yes.
player who viciously defended it as part of the panel. In fact, the only person who didn't, I think, was Kelly Rudy. Was the only one that was like, no, that shouldn't happen, if I remember correctly.
Mm-hmm.
It's crazy to me that any former player can think like, yeah, that's completely justified. And I think it's really dangerous, especially from someone like Kevin Bieksa, who's kind of known as like a tough guy, like man's man, to really be purporting that message, because a lot of people are going to latch onto it because he's kind of a figurehead for it. They're going to be like, look at this tough guy, he clearly knows, he was in it, and clearly it isn't right. Like, there's no good argument of why this sort of incident should have happened. And it was a big mistake by Kevin Bieksa to even spout that this was a possibly reasonable response. It's really disgusting to hear that, and from all former players who are insinuating that, it's disgusting. Shouldn't happen. And if Ridley Greig had been injured for multiple months, even like because of post-concussion syndrome, which is serious and oftentimes restricts a player's ability to play, I think the narrative would also be very different. I think because Ridley Greig got up right away, it was kind of like, oh, it's fine, it's just a hockey play. But if he was injured, we'd have a much more serious discussion on our hands. And I think it should be serious, because just because that didn't happen doesn't mean that it couldn't happen in the future. So I think a lot of people are being purposefully disingenuous, and it's dangerous. It's dangerous to talk that way.
Yep, exactly. And I think I might have mentioned this when we were talking about the Perron cross-check on Zub, but I have been cross-checked in the back of the head like that before, and I got a concussion from that when I was a teenager, and it affected my life for a while. Trying to go to school and learn when you're just actively concussed for like a month or two after an event like that seriously messed with my brain development, and I ended up getting a concussion like a year or two later as well, and then I had to just totally stop playing hockey at that point. Like, I could have tried to keep going, but it wasn't worth it at that point at a pretty low level. So this type of thing hits close to home for me when I see someone just go straight two hands with the stick right to someone's head. I think that's one of the worst things you can do in this sport. Like, a lot of the time when we're debating dirty plays and dirty hits and stuff with like kneeing or hits to the head, there's usually at least an argument that is like, oh, I was trying to make a legal hit, but I messed up and I accidentally did a kind of a dirty hit. But there's literally never an excuse for a cross check that isn't part of the play. Sometimes you will see cross checks in front of the net in a net front battle between a forward and a defenseman, and sometimes the stick accidentally goes too high, and that happens, and that should be suspendable too. But I did see some Leafs fans bringing up examples like that where they're like, oh, why isn't this getting an in-person hearing? Where it's like, well, there's at least a little bit of benefit of the doubt there that like in the middle of a play where two guys are jostling, that your stick rides up accidentally. Whereas this, maybe the stick rode up a little bit off of Ridley Greig's shoulder, but this was like distinctly targeted and not part of the play. I think that's a key thing here, is that it's not a hockey play. It's not something that happens accidentally as a result of in-game action. It's entirely the fault of Morgan Reilly, and he has to own it.
Agreed. Like, a word we've been using a lot while talking about this has been intentional. A word that a lot of Leafs fans seemingly have forgotten. The biggest problem with this was there's no excuse that Reilly was accidentally going for his midsection. He was just trying to, jab him down low or something. This was explicitly an intentional headshot. There is no argument that it wasn't. All those micro-analyzing clips that we've mentioned before, they don't show the full story, especially when you look down that glass view. They show a complete intent to hit him high, in the head even, I would say. And that can't be a part of it. That needs to be suspended harshly. And like, if it's an accident, like you were talking about, where like it's an accidental elbow off of an attempted clean check, or it's a cross-checking battle where it happens by accident, again, should still be suspendable. But I think there's an argument for why that suspension should be less, like 2-3 games, even. But I think just because of how intentional it was, also the timing, 5 seconds left in the third period, you're really going to injure someone at that point in the game. Yeah. Again, can't happen. Exactly. Game's almost over. There's literally no excuse. And I think, honestly, like the Leafs fans that have been trying to like absolve it completely, obviously they're bad, and obviously that's a stupid opinion that has no backing in any realistic realm. The people that annoy me more have been the people that are like, yeah, I think he should be suspended, but I'm glad he did it.
Yeah.
What the hell are you talking about?
That's just deranged.
It is. He should get flamed for this. And just because you think he should get suspended, this play should have never happened. Like, even though you agree that it should be punishable, doesn't absolve you of just caring about another person's well-being, in this case, Ridley Greig, just because he hurt your feelings a little bit by taking a slap shot into an empty net in a game that, even if he completely missed the net, 5 seconds, it was over. You're not altering anything by getting into an altercation with him. And I guess the last place we haven't gone with this, disgusting responses by Martin Jones, Sheldon Keefe, and Ryan Reeves about this.
I was going to bring that up next, especially Reeves.
And I would also say especially Keefe.
Yes. Because
a coach basically condoning this is a message to all his players saying, yeah, if this happens again, you show him. Like, you do whatever you want because you're showing yourself to be tough. That can never, ever happen. This should never, ever happen again. And frankly, it's Bush League from Keefe. Keefe is an idiot for saying that. And I don't need any proof that he's a bad coach in the playoffs. Yeah. His team withers away. He has no force behind that bench anymore. They're fighting for a wild card spot. I fully believe that the Leafs will make the playoffs. I'm not really scared of them not making it in any way. But frankly, it's not working out. They're frustrated. They're taking out this frustration on this situation. And Keefe is sinking his teeth into it. Disgusting. Absolutely disgusting.
In Elliot Friedman's podcast, he laughed off the notion that Keefe was encouraging violent acts. He just didn't even answer the question. Like, Jeff Merrick was like, oh yeah, what do you think of the take that some people are saying that Sheldon Keefe's comments were bad? And Elliot was just like, oh, and that's so ridiculous, and didn't even bother to acknowledge it, which I think was just more petty homerism from him. Because how hard is it as a coach to just say, yeah, I understand why Morgan Reilly was angry, but he can't do that and can't get himself kicked out of the game and get a suspension, you know? Like, that's not, to me, I get that you want to stand by your guys, but to me, that's not like throwing your player under the bus or anything. That's just being honest about the reality, because it was extremely obvious that he was going to get a Department of Player Safety hearing. So all you should really be able to say as a coach is, like, stand up for your guy a little bit and be like, yeah, I don't think he should have gone that far, but I understand why he was mad. Like, that's all he had to say, but instead he just said, like, yeah, this is fine. It's good that our player did this, which is just fucking stupid.
I agree. It's annoying because I understand that Keefe was very angry with the game overall. He was like had a shouting match with the ref over a play that he thought Stutzla dove. By the way, if you watch the clip, it wasn't a dive. There's a stick going into Stutzla's skates. He falls. It's a trip. That's
The
a
stick
trip
bent.
every time.
You saw the flex on the stick.
Yeah, it almost got under both legs if you watch it slowly. Like it's a trip. It's blatantly a trip. You're only angry because Stützle has this reputation as a diver. I don't think he's a diver at all. I think there are times where he doesn't try very hard to stay up. And I know that there's like a conversation whether that's embellishment, but 99% of the time, it's a legitimate penalty what happens to him. And he just doesn't try to keep going with the play, even though I think he should more. Like, legitimately, I think he should. But wasn't a dive, first of all. I still understand that you're angry. Still, like, you have every opportunity now to recuse yourself or say, hey, those past statements, yeah, I was like heated up. That shouldn't have happened. Like, the suspension is deserved. And you could talk about like whether you think the length is appropriate or not, but calling that play appropriate because of what he said, I think you're all aware of what happened, I think was the quote. Garbage, absolute garbage. And then hearing Martin Jones echo that, it's clear that that's trickling down from the coach. And I don't know if you want to quickly highlight what Ryan Reeves said, because that was also awful.
Before we get to that, we do have the breaking news that it's a 5-game suspension.
Oh, did that just come out now?
Yep, just got it on Twitter. So, in my mind, I didn't get a chance to say my prediction before it came out, but I was going to say 5 games because I figured that it's so incredibly similar to the Perron on Zub incident, except that there was... you could argue, and I'm sure the Leafs argued, that there was a little bit of riding up the shoulder on the cross-check, which was really the only, like, slightly decent argument that they had to get a lower number of games in the suspension. So I think 5 is pretty much dead on what I was expecting.
Yeah, I think that's generally fair. Also, like, another difference, I guess, in the Perron clip was that Perron cross-checked someone in the head who wasn't involved in the play whatsoever. Like, Zub was just a bystander. It was Joseph who accidentally, and I will hold that it wasn't intentional, accidentally hit Larkin in the head on that play. So that does make it a little bit different. But otherwise, yeah, I think that this is a fair suspension. I think it makes sense. And I genuinely think that if you have a play where it is clear that a player intended to headshot someone, it should be automatic 5 games every time and go up from there. That's my personal opinion, because it can't stay in the game.
Yep, totally agreed. I think this is good from the Department of Player Safety, and obviously they're often very questionable, but this is setting a more of a trend with the Perron one and the Reilly one, that this is what we would like to see more of. So once again, all the Leafs fans pulling up older incidents and saying, I can't believe this didn't get anything, I can't believe this got less games than what Reilly is going to get. Obviously, those should have been higher suspensions too, but that doesn't mean that we should let Reilly off the hook now and give him a lower one, which is what they're trying to argue, which is just completely disingenuous. The correct take here is that 5 games is fair, and all those other incidents in the past, that they should be punishing them harsher, and hopefully going forward in the future, they will keep this standard, you know?
Yeah, that's the right opinion. And I honestly don't understand the argument of like, look at these past clips, because clearly if we're people who think that head protection is super important, we would go back and look at those clips and be like, yeah, no, they should have been more. Why shouldn't this one? Like, with that logic, why can't I go back to like the 1980s where it was like perfectly legal to like chop off someone's head in the middle of the play, and that would be part of the code? Why can't I go back to that and be like, well, I mean, this happened, so clearly that's part of the code. Why isn't that allowed now? It wasn't punished that bad then. Why is Reilly receiving anything? Not a single Leafs fan would make that argument at all, because they realize that it's completely stupid. And going back to clips even from 4 years ago is stupid, wrong in the same way.
Yeah, and wasn't it, I think, in the 32 Thoughts podcast as well, they were talking about like, oh, can you imagine if this happened in the 70s or the 80s? It would have been so much more violent. And it's like, okay, it didn't.
Yeah,
we're in 2024 now, and we care more about head injuries, and the league themselves has tried to be a little more harsh on them, even though it still might not even be enough. So it's just stupid arguments. Anything looking at the past stuff is stupid, because the league is clearly trying to set a stronger precedent for anything that isn't a hockey play, happens not during game time, happens like after the whistle, and it's just a deliberate headshot with a stick. Like, they're cracking down on it, and they should be.
Agreed. Like, we have so much new information about CTE, what concussions do for a post-playing career now. We didn't have that in the 70s or 80s. Like Paul Correa was concussed, was sent back out there, scored a goal. He doesn't even remember it. We
Yeah.
recognize
Oh my God.
like now we recognize how incredibly dangerous that was. Like he legitimately could have died if the wrong thing happened, or he would never have been the same person. Again, if the wrong thing had happened. That doesn't need to be there anymore now that we understand what could happen. We understand the lifelong effects. Like it's super sad to bring up, but even like the Chris Benoit story, just heartbreaking because of concussions. It's a serious issue, needs to be taken seriously. I'm glad it was taken seriously here. And I will call out the Department of Player Safety the second they see an incident like this and give it a 1 game to 3 game suspension because it deserves more. That's just the standard now.
Which is exactly why I hate Ryan Reeves talking about make hockey violent again. Sure, if you just want to talk about fights, where you at least have 2 willing combatants and the guy's consenting to getting in the fight, compared to a cheap shot, like that's the thing, we're talking about a cheap shot, so you shouldn't be saying things like that in this context, you know? It's just... It just makes him look like a complete meathead. He's an irrelevant player. He got on the ice at the last 5 seconds and he couldn't even manage to get at anyone. The refs held him back. So he's so big. You'd think he would just be able to overpower them and get through, right? But he's a clown.
Did you see the clip as well? I think you can see Brady Tkachuk yelling from the bench and he's saying like he's talking to Kastelik because Kastelik was also on. He's like, "Don't fight him. He's useless."
Yeah.
Something like that. Absolutely hilarious and so true.
Mm-hmm. Ryan Reeves is just butthurt that he's an afterthought in this league anymore. He can't keep up. His knees are completely shot, and his role is almost completely useless at this point. I think he was a decent player a few years ago. I think he had a solid physical element when he was leading the league in hits, but he just can't keep up anymore, and he's butthurt that the league is changing and that he's going to lose his job real soon.
Yeah, enjoy the buyout in the summer, buddy.
Yeah, exactly.
You'll have fun on Robodai Island, maybe too, with the Leafs history.
Yeah, so I think that's all the time and thoughts we have to give on that bum. So,
agreed.
All in all, any closing thoughts?
I do want to say that like this entire time we've been kind of harping on Leafs fans. That is the majority of the people that have been campaigning this in an opposite direction. Like I said, other fan bases have been extremely rational and seem to be on the side of this shouldn't happen. A suspension is justified and it should be harsh. I do want to say I recognize that there are Leafs fans out there that did look at this incident and do agree that it cannot happen. I don't want to lump all of you into a group. I understand that there's varied perspectives on this. I apologize for most of your fan base. Honestly, I think like if this had happened and it had just been a fight, in and of itself, it wouldn't have gone off in the same way it did.
Exactly.
But it still would have rekindled this battle, this rivalry. And I think that's important because it has been stale for a while. It hasn't been as infused. And it's honestly, I was kind of disappointed that was the last showing of the season between the two teams. It would have been very interesting to see them come up against each other with that new vilified hatred. But that's the end of it now. And it's like we've been saying all along. A response is justified in that situation. I could understand why you'd feel disrespected. I still think Greig did nothing wrong in slapshotting it in. I think it's a great showing of personality that the league needs more of. But a head hit cannot happen. A response justified in the right sense of physicality. What happened completely wrong, objectively wrong, and could have really hurt a player, deserves to be punished.
I 100% agree. I think that's where we'll leave it for today. If you would like to follow us elsewhere on social media, we are on Twitter at the links in the description. Thanks everyone for listening.